I just wanted to briefly introduce our keynote speaker, Ed Luce, who I've read for many years as a writer in the Financial Times. He's the author of a recent book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and we very much look forward to hearing what he has to say today.
Thank you very much, Jim. I've got an iPhone underneath me with vague notes, so if I look down, it's not because I'm about to sneeze. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've learned a lot from this morning's sessions. I apologize for not being brilliantly prepared for the panel, but I've done a little bit more thought about what I'm going to talk to you about today, and the title that Helena and Jim asked for, based, I think, on a column you'd read of mine a few months ago, is Liberalism and the Arc of History. Now, I should say, as I think I said on the panel earlier, that I'm a little bit of an imposter because this audience is composed of academic scholars, specialists, and I'm very much a product of sort of the British system of generalism, that liberal arts education that is decidedly and pointedly not specialist, that is multidisciplinary, that at its best has a broad sense of history and can skate across many subjects, and can express itself very well, and understand the art of the possible. But at its worst, which I believe we're seeing exhibited today by people I actually went to university with, at its worst, it's a kind of series of late-night essay crises, long nights filled with cramming stuff that you ought to have been doing more diligently over longer periods of time, that are filled with honeyed words of dead poets and scribblers of whom they know very little. An example of this, of course, is somebody who was a couple of years above me at university, David Cameron, who posed and made the fatal error of posing an essay question to the British public to which he did not know their answer. A few days later, he left office, whistling famously a ditty under his breath, which was a sort of perfect metaphor, really, for, forgive me for being cruel, somebody who had gone through life without ever having to pay the consequences for mistakes that he had made, and he's not paying for this consequence either. Another is Boris Johnson, who was about 4 years above me, who, with a great meretricious honeyed skill, helped persuade the British public of something of which he knew almost nothing either, trade policy. Doesn't know much about immigration policy, and is paying a price in terms of the judgment of reality. He is as cruelly judged, I think, over time by reality as he is serenely unjudged to date by politics. And I'll just mention a third of the bad examples of the education system I went through, and that is Jeremy Hunt, Britain's current Foreign Secretary, who replaced Boris Johnson in July, and who gave a speech this week to the Conservative Party conference, in which he likened, in the context of the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, he likened membership of the European Union to their former imprisonment within the Soviet Union. So the sort of sense of history, multidisciplinary fluency with the world as it is not being exhibited brilliantly by the liberal arts education of which I was a product. But there are better sides to it. I'm going to really, really do my best to exhibit it, but if I fail, don't worry, I tried. Why do I mention this? Not just to point out and triple underline that I'm a journalist and not a scholar, but also because this is entitled Many Faces of Liberalism, and the liberal arts education is a very important face of liberalism. That sort of, I would call it, in terms of my country, but I think to some degree, liberal arts education in the United States, more of a sensibility than a faith, a sort of quiet intellectual insouciance about the direction the world is going in, that is coming unstuck, is receiving a rude awakening. There are other versions, there are other faces of liberalism, one of which I'm going to talk about now, the arc of history, which is, I think, a slightly more faith-based, less sensibility-oriented version of it. The phrase, of course, was first really used by Martin Luther King to brilliantly inspire people to the larger sense of an inclusive American dream, to, I guess, deracialize it, to pick up on what previous exponents of American providence had meant only for non-black and non-native Americans. And it was picked up and again repopularized by Obama, and it's become in the last few years, last 10, 12 years or so, I think a very shop-worn, a very well-used phrase, and I think it stands in a shorthand for something we're all familiar with, that to some degree we were all raised with, which is a sort of quiet teleology, a quiet confidence that, a bit like the stock market, it might go down sometimes, but the longer-term trend in that line is up, and that we're basically all passive index investors, and we're going to do pretty well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. At its best, of course, it is an inspirer. It's a motivator, and Obama, of course, was a brilliant motivator, particularly in his first election campaign. At its worst, like more conventional theologies, it is immune to, it is prone to confirmation bias, and it is relatively insulated from contrary facts and narratives and realities that challenge this sense of the upward sort of march of progress, of the direction of history. And the phrase being on the wrong side of history is a natural corollary to talking of the arc of history. So when Putin annexes Crimea, he is on the wrong side of history. He is doing something that used to be done in the 19th century. When social conservatives argue against marriage equality, they are on the wrong side of history. This is something that will happen, is happening. Or indeed, to bring it back to my own country of origin, Brexit, when the Brexit campaign was happening, Obama, if you might remember, was invited by Cameron over to Britain to help make his case. Obama used the wrong side of history phrase, that history is going away from nationalism, it's going away from tribalism, it's going away from conflict, it's going away from geopolitics. And I think the problem with all of this, with this way of thinking that blips might happen and that interruptions might occur, but we will resume at some point our upward trajectory, is that it actually undercuts this theological, this faith-based liberalism, actually undercuts what I find, to me personally, is the most important quality of liberalism, which is not to fall into groupthink, is to challenge your assumptions the whole time, to test them, to submit them to reality tests, to people who disagree with them, is to argue. A sort of more of a Millian sense of liberalism and less of an historicist one. And so we find now that the people who most people here, I think, including me, believe deserve to be consigned to the dustbin of history, to the trash can of history, are now, at least temporarily, in its driving seat. And I think this is partly because we fell prey to a sort of light form of liberal theology. We didn't see it coming. So let me propose sort of two arguments here. Well, one argument, but with two sort of extended examples. The argument I want to make is the arc of history has served its purpose. It's no longer useful. The idea of history as contingency, as one famous thinker said, might be too terrifying for the human soul to bear. but actually I think it's not only a more accurate description of the way history works, I think it's a better motivator to action. In the context today, that's an easier point to make. Things can go wrong in history. The stock market can fall. It can fall further. Then it can stay there, and it can fall further. Teleology doesn't automatically put things right. And I want to talk about this in two ways. One is about the crisis of liberalism globally, or for shorthand, the crisis of the West. The crisis without, if you like. And the other is to talk about the crisis inside Western democracies, the crisis within. And let me start the crisis without by giving an anecdote that, with apologies to those who've read my book that Bill so kindly referenced, is what I begin my book on the Retreat of Western Liberalism with. And that is in November 1989, when I was a student, hearing of the opening of Checkpoint Charlie and the fall of the Berlin Wall. I and four other students, got on a train to Dover, took a ferry from Dover to Zeebrugge, rented a car in Zeebrugge, and drove at extremely high speed from Zeebrugge to Berlin. And there were no speed limits on the Autobahn in those days, and so we exploited that. And we got there, and we found the wall, thousands and thousands of people on this wall, basically picking it apart. We borrowed little chisels and pickaxes from strangers, and we laid into it. So we were sort of figuratively dismantling history. At least that's in our sort of semi-drunken state what we thought we were up to. We participated in this orgy of historic vandalism, is the way I like to think of it. And our mindset then was very much the one that Fukuyama had just written about in the National Interest, that was later to turn into a book, but I think it was in the July-August issue that year of the National Interest. An argument, oddly enough, that we were already aware of about the end of history, and I don't need to rehearse that argument to you. Over the next decade or so, history went as it had been programmed, as we expected it to. Not just the former Warsaw Pact countries, which for the most part, Romania excluded, democratized without a shot being fired. But around the world, if you looked at the index of democracies on the Asian continent, in Central Asia, in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in most places other than the Middle East, the number of democracies in the world just kept rising throughout the 1990s, but extraordinary numbers. But then, since the year 2000, something's happened. Fukuyama calls it a democratic recession. Basically, there are 25 fewer democracies in the world today than there were 18 years ago at the beginning of this century. And these aren't little countries. This isn't sort of Burkina Faso I'm talking about. It's Russia, which in the late 1990s, however imperfect and oligarchic Yeltsin's Russia was definitely on that arc. It was definitely improving. Russia under Putin, of course, has ceased in any recognizable sense to be a democracy. Turkey, was being discussed interestingly on the previous panel, can no longer, I think, realistically be described as a level playing field democracy. There are all kinds of countries in all kinds of continents, some obvious like Venezuela, some less so like Thailand, which have ceased to be democracies. And of course, most disturbingly, at the source, at ground zero of 1989, countries like Hungary and Poland, which had democratized without a struggle, or at least without mass bloodshed, are now beginning to question the basic precepts of liberal democracy. So what's happened, and what does it mean for the future of liberalism? Well, I think the best way I can sort of put this in shorthand is to describe the events since 2000, the events of the 21st century, in terms of three geopolitical windfalls for China. The first windfall is how we responded to 9/11. Not just the global war on terror and the suspension of various sort of core habeas corpus rights and liberties and due processes that were seen as unsuspendable, as integral to any condition of being Western and of being liberal democratic, but of course the Iraq War in 2003, which became post factum about exporting democracy to the Middle East, was of course justified in terms of weapons of mass destruction and imminent threats and links between the Iraqi regime and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of other things which point by point, case by case, were disproven. Whilst we spent all this hard money and hard power on that venture, we lost an enormous amount of soft power. And China, of course, kept growing. It wasn't spending money on wars of choice, and it was quietly reaping the gains of a West that was busy, or at least large parts of the West, led by the United States, partnered by the able Tony Blair, that was squandering the West's power and money. The second windfall was the Lehman Brothers-induced financial collapse of 2008, that of course produced this meltdown, this extraordinary measures by central banks, TARP and quantitative easing and so on, and which led to what many people still, I think, rather lazily call a global recession, but what was in fact just an Atlantic recession. It wasn't a global recession at all. China kept growing at double-digit rates, as others did at near double-digit, such as India and other large developing countries. And the stagnation, the Warren Buffett phrase about when the tide goes out, you realize how many people have been swimming naked, was, I think, very well illustrated in the wake of 2008, that a lot of people who felt they were keeping up actually turned out weren't keeping up at all. They were borrowing on dubious terms with means they did not possess. So that's windfall number 2. But windfall number 3 is, I think, the most important of these, and that's the events of 2016, the Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump, which undercut the arguments that those within China who want to push for more democratization, for more liberalization of the political system there, it undercut them, it cut their legs off. Because the argument that had been made in China, and believe me, the Chinese permitted safe dissident community within the think tanks in Beijing, where some debate is allowed, have an incredibly sophisticated grasp of Western politics, and they can argue, every presidential election, they can argue why Nixon should have defeated McGovern in 1972, why it was right Reagan defeated Carter in 80, why Bush should have beaten Dukakis in 88, and so on and so forth. That the argument that people are wise, that there is a collective wisdom of crowds in the democratic system, that the West, that good democracies tend to make the right choices, was obviously undercut very, very heavily by the events of 2016. And I think it's no accident. It's been a year now since Xi Jinping's 19th Party Congress, where he appoints himself president for life and enshrines Xi Jinping thought up there with Maoism and Deng Xiaoping as immortalized thought in the Chinese party constitution. I think it's no accident that there was incredibly little pushback to that. Partly it's because there's so much greater surveillance and technological ability to stifle dissent, but partly it's because the legs had been cut under those arguing for China gradually liberalizing politically. Now, what's China's view of history? Well, China's view of history and the traditional Chinese idea, sense of temporal history, is a circular one, like the ancient Greek one. It's not a Judeo-Christian linear, and since then secularized Marxist and liberal one, linear one of a continued progress. It is a circular view of history, which to the Chinese is very reassuring, because after what they describe as a century of humiliation, between the mid-19th century and the Communist Revolution in 1949, they are now about halfway through, a little bit more, a century of restoration, of restoring China's traditional very large, not outsized, but befittingly sized place in the world, that history is coming full circle back to China. I don't know which is correct, circular or linear, and I'm not going to make any profound theological arguments about time and history to you today. You'll be very pleased to hear that the liberal arts education in Britain didn't extend to that elective topic. But I would say that pragmatically, I think an underused sort of feature of Western philosophy, pragmatism, something Tocqueville talked about as well, that our sense of pragmatism should teach us to be very solicitous of what that other 88% of the world that isn't the West thinks about the march of history and thinks what it means, because it means very, very different things to people in different parts of the non-West. And so pragmatism, I think, should teach us to preach less and listen more on the geopolitical stage. That is the crisis of liberalism without. We are, of course, going through a crisis of liberal democracy within. Now, the panel earlier, I touched a little bit upon the economic side to this. And I don't think you need too much rehearsal as to the numbers, but I'll just give you a very quick sort of thumbnail about the median wage stagnation problem. This is not something, that erupted in the last few years or even in 2008. This has been a feature of Western incomes for a generation or more, and with the exception of the 1990s, middle-class incomes have basically been stagnating across most of the West, with notable exceptions in the former Soviet Union, in the former Warsaw Pact, I should correct myself, of Poland and Hungary. We're aware of the fact that inequality has got far worse. It's now a sort of Great Gatsby curve, 1920s levels. We're aware, of course, of the fact that income mobility, I think that really sort of key ingredient of a society of equality of opportunity, has declined markedly, and in the United States is now the lowest amongst the richest nations. It's at about half the rate. Your chances of being born into the bottom 10th or decile or quintile are about half the chances you have in Canada or Germany of moving up to the top decile or quintile. And that's an extraordinary picture for America. Britain never really got up to where America was, so it hasn't fallen down. But America and Britain are both very, very poor rankings on the income mobility. And so this is what I call triple cocktail of median wage stagnation, median household income stagnation, declining income mobility, and rising inequality is well known. What strikes me more is a Gallup poll that's been done for many, many years now on self-identification. When Americans are asked, do you belong to the lower class, the middle class, or the upper middle class? And there's a very good time series. And in 2000, at the beginning of the century, 31% of Americans identified as lower class. By 2016, that had risen to 48% of Americans identified as lower class. Now, what's really puzzling is that since 2016, that number's fallen back down quite sharply to about 34%. And it's also troubling because if you look at what's happened to incomes, the median weekly earnings have actually fallen in real terms in the last 18 months. Median household income, which is a different measure, has just regained in 2017 where it was in 2007. But median individual weekly earnings are actually lower today than they were in 2016. And yet the number of people who identify as lower class has dropped quite sharply. And the reason why this is troubling, we're all familiar with the, I think, relatively false debate that goes on between those who blame populism on pure economics and those who blame populism, to use a shorthand, on deplorability. or what pollsters euphemistically call cultural anxiety. I think it's clearly a chemical interaction between the two. It's clearly both. But the troubling way that this data, this Gallup data points, and I think it's more interesting data because it's how people think of themselves, it's about self-perception, it's a better guide to politics, is that there are a lot of people, a lot of white people, who feel their status has gone up since Trump was elected, that somebody is arguing their corner. And that is a disturbing aspect of politics today, to put it mildly. What happens when people lose faith? If we're talking about a conventional religion, when people lose faith, they turn in one of two directions. They either sort of gradually become more and more agnostic, and just stop participating. And I think we've seen a decline of faith in our political system over the last 20 years or so. And that might be measured by declining voting turnout, membership of parties, news consumption, and so on, and civic engagement, more bowling alone as well. That's one response to losing faith. Another response is to embrace militant atheism or even nihilism. And I think that response, translated into politics today, is a way of thinking about Trumpianism and a way of thinking about other kinds of populism in the West, is that we have lost faith in the glue that kept, I think, Western societies together, which is the belief in meritocracy, that meritocracy is actually real, the belief in equality of opportunity, that it actually means something, and the belief that, to some extent, undefinably, we're all in this together. It's not like we've got elites that are just robbing us blind. And I would say that that loss of faith, with the very, very different reactions we've seen to that loss of faith, politically speaking, that loss of faith is an entirely reasonable response to the way the system has developed. The policies that people are pursuing are not remotely reasonable. Trumpianism is a cure worse than the disease. But the diagnosis that this system of meritocracy is essentially a sham is, I think, pretty well grounded in people's everyday common sense experience of what it takes to get into Ivy League, of how many legacy places are reserved for people whose parents went there, of how much money basically talks, and of how few areas of life today and in society and government and anything are immune to the sound of money, of how everything is transactional. I think that that's very hard to define. There's no one index or graph that can capture that. But I don't think you need to be educated, have a degree, to be in the service sector. I don't think you need to be black or white or male or female to have a sense that it's broken. That's not, in my view, an unreasonable diagnosis. The reaction, of course, is something different. So what would I conclude with? I want to go back to the arc of history here. I think the best religions, to continue the religious analogy, the best religions are those that are about deeds and not words. They're about works that are visible to fellow humankind. And they're about broad churches, not narrow ones. The most important test, I think, that the Western crisis from without and the liberal crisis from within faces, in a way that no other election in our lifetime could possibly compare with, is what happens in 2020. Now, if you think about this from the point of view of the rest of the world, most of which would like the West to succeed and aspires to have something like Western political rights. The 2016 election could be written off as a sort of bunch of aberrations. Hillary was a uniquely bad wooden candidate. You had all this stuff happening like Comey reopening the email investigation. You have the electoral college quirks, and just 77,000 could have voted. There's all kinds of, but. It's just a sort of perfect storm. Trump got elected. Trump being re-elected is quite a different matter. It is 2016 times 3, or 5, to be Trumpian. 2016 times infinity. It's a lot bigger. I think it would confirm to the world that this wasn't an accident, that America has made a choice. And I think it would confirm to America that there is this sort of growing, unbridgeable divide between two extremely different, sort of not quite civil war we were discussing at lunch level, but kind of atmosphere that you might associate with the 1850s, if you were to choose a decade, to analogize to today's atmosphere. What will it take to defeat Trump in 2020? I have no idea. I don't know who the candidate would be. I don't know what the platform would be. In our sort of ideal scenario, we'll all suddenly become sort of vaguely capitalist Scandinavian social democrats, and we'll realize that there ought to be a sort of broad-based platform that with equality of respect, but investment and sort of equality of opportunity, a new Marshall Plan for the middle classes that isn't about racial difference and so on. Failing that, breaking out, we're going to have to see how pragmatism works and what those who wish to defeat Trump produce in 2020. But one thing I will say is that if Trump is defeated in 2020, which I, as a columnist, I'm permitted to say, I sincerely hope he is. If Trump is defeated, it won't then turn out that Trump was a blip on the arc of history, as President Obama said the other day, a few months ago, which is in fact what prompted that column that you picked up on. It won't be because Trump was a blip on the arc of history, and it won't be because the arc of history is renewing its upward journey. It will be because people realize history can go either way. And that a great deal is at stake here, and that it requires actual human intervention, that humans do make history as they deserve. And I think that is a very esoteric point to some audiences, but to you, this is probably sort of like very lowbrow. So I wouldn't recommend this as an election campaign, but I do think history as contingency is a better motivator to action than a belief that history is on some predetermined course. So with that, thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.